Angela Rayner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's a pleasure to welcome yet another Deputy Prime Minister to the dispatch box, the third deputy that I've faced in 3 years. And you know what they say, the third time's a charm. And I'm also pleased to note, Mr. Speaker, that the Prime Minister has a working-class friend, finally. I seem to remember that after the loss of 300 Conservative seats at last year's local elections, the Right Honourable gentleman resigned, saying someone must take responsibility. After 1,000 more Conservative councillors had been given the boot by voters, who does he think is responsible now?
Well, Mr. Speaker, in the spirit of the Right Honourable Lady's opening remarks, can I just say it really is a pleasure to see the Right Honourable Lady here today. I was, though, expecting to face the Labour leader's choice for the next Deputy Prime Minister if they win the election, so I'm surprised that the Lib Dem leader isn't taking questions today. And, Mr. Speaker, you will forgive me, Mr. Speaker, you will forgive me if I take the Right Honourable Lady's predictions with a pinch of salt. After all, she confidently predicted that the Right Honourable Member for Islington North would one day be Prime Minister. Remember, this is a man who wanted to abolish the army, scrap Trident, withdraw from NATO and abandon Ukraine. And what did she say to that? She couldn't wait for him to be Prime Minister.
Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, it's absolutely amazing that while the Labour Party is preparing to govern with a Labour majority, his party is starting to prepare for opposition, Mr. Speaker. And this week, at the National Conservative Conference, a member for Devisers blamed the country's problems on a new religion. He even hit out at the dystopian fantasy of John Lennon. The member for Pentonstone and Stockbridge said identifying falling birthing rates is the overarching threat to the UK. She criticised woke teaching for destroying children's souls and causing self-harm and suicide among people. And the Right Honourable Member for North East Somerset really let the cat out the bag when he said parties that try to gerrymander end up finding their clever schemes come back to bite them, as dare I said we found when insisting on voter ID. The Right Honourable gentleman opposite, while working in Number 10, said he had to listen to the radio every morning to find out what was really going on in the country. Apparently, he was surprised on a daily basis by what he learned. And most of his time was spent on day-to-day crisis management. 11 years on, Mr. Speaker, nothing has changed.
Deputy Prime Minister.
I'm not quite sure what the question was then, Mr. Speaker. But if she wants to talk about this sort of thing, we all know what's going on with her and her leader. It's all lovey-dovey on the surface. They turn it on for the cameras, but as soon as they're off, it's a different story. They're at each other's throats. Mr. Speaker, they're the Phil and Holly of British politics.
Deputy Leader.
Mr. Speaker.
Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The reality is, after 13 years of Tory rule, they're still lurching from crisis to crisis and wallowing in their own mess. They can't solve the crisis because they are the crisis. The honourable member opposite should take more note of what's happening at his conferences in his party before trying to make up what's happening in mine. The Prime Minister pledged that by March, NHS waiting lists would fall. It's now May. So can he tell us, since he made that pledge, is the number of people waiting on late waiting lists higher or lower?
Mr. Speaker, we are making good progress, for example, with two-year waiting lists. But the Right Honourable Lady seems to forget a crucial fact. The United Kingdom experienced an unprecedented pandemic. Right before COVID, GP satisfaction was high. Delayed discharges were half. Ambulance targets were being met. And she knows that right now, in Labour-run Wales, exactly the same challenges are being faced. The difference between us is, on this side of the House, we've got a plan to fix it, while she's too busy playing petty politics.
Mr. Speaker, even before the pandemic, waiting lists were going up. So it doesn't wash that this government, after 13 years in power, is blaming everybody but themselves for what people are having to put up with. He appears to be claiming that 11,000 patients waiting more than 18 months is an achievement. The last Labour government reduced waiting times from 18 months to 18 weeks, and he can come back to me when he's achieved that. The fact is, Mr. Speaker, waiting lists are longer than when the Prime Minister made his pledge 5 months ago. The number of people in England waiting to start hospital treatment is the highest since records began. 7.3 million patients left waiting. Now, I know the Prime Minister has his own private GP, so maybe he doesn't appreciate the urgency. But he's left people like my constituent Carol waiting for over a year for an urgent appointment, moved from waiting list to waiting list with appointments cancelled again and again. So if not now, when will waiting lists fall?
Order. It'll continue till I hear the end of this question. If I get any more interruptions, it will take longer. Angela Rayner.
Mr. Speaker, they don't want to hear the question because they know the answer. They know the answer is that they failed the British people. So when will waiting lists fall?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, I would gently say to the Right Honourable Lady, if she cares that much about access to our healthcare, why is she opposing our minimum service levels? They will provide core emergency services with vital cover during healthcare strikes. Does she not think that vulnerable patients deserve that level of care, or is she too weak to stand up to her union paymasters?
Mr. Speaker, we all want minimum service levels. It's this government that have failed to provide minimum service levels in all of our trains, in all of our public services, because they've run them down and mismanaged them for the last 13 years. Now, it's not just waiting times, Mr. Speaker. 13 years after the Landmark Marmot review into child poverty, Sir Michael says this government is on track to make child poverty worse, with more than a quarter of our children living in poverty last year. When I was a young mum, I remember the sick feeling in my stomach not knowing if my wages would cover the bills. Yet his government has taken a wrecking ball to measures by the last Labour government to eradicate child poverty, even abolishing the Child Poverty Unit. They tried to justify this by saying they no longer needed a Child Poverty Unit because they've abolished the child poverty targets. So can he tell us what level of poverty he considers to be a success?
I'd say to the Right Honourable Lady, this comprehensive schoolboy is not going to take any lectures from the party opposite about the lives of working people. What I would say is that we have introduced record increases in the national living wage, something that this party introduced, the party opposite failed to do so. And we have taken 1 million working-age people out of poverty altogether. That is the record of my party, and one of which I am very proud.
Mr. Speaker, the last Labour government made it their mission to reduce the number of children in poverty by 1 million. We achieved that. Under the Tories, child poverty is nearly back to the level it was when Labour last inherited the Tory mess. After 13 years of the Tories, they're stuck in a conveyor belt of crisis. And while his party is preparing for opposition with their Trump Tribute Act conference over the road, Labour are focused on fixing the real problems facing British people. The Tories have picked their side. They're for the vested interests, for the oil companies and the bankers, for those that are profiting from the crisis and not suffering from it. Whether it's failing the millions of people anxiously waiting for treatment or overseeing a rise in child poverty. And while his colleagues spout nonsense at their carnival of conspiracy, I want to know, When will his party stop blaming everybody else and realise that the problem is them?
Mr. Speaker, I will proudly defend our record in office. Crime down 50%, near record levels of employment, a record minimum wage. And what, Mr. Speaker, what's their record? 4 general election defeats, 30 promises already broken, and 1 leader who let anti-Semitism run wild. That is why the British people will never trust the Labour Party.